The morning Ruth and Walter Hale returned from the doctor, their son had changed the locks on the farm office. Evan was waiting on the porch with a leather folder, 2 witnesses, and the careful voice of a man pretending he was doing something kind. He told them a memory assessment proved they could no longer manage the farm safely. Their bank accounts had been frozen. Their seed inventory had been transferred to a corporate partner. By sunset, 57 years of work had been reduced to 3 suitcases beside the road. Ruth was 79. Walter was 82. Neither of them had forgotten how to read a field, judge a storm, or keep a harvest alive through a dry season. But Evan had scheduled Ruth's test while she was recovering from an infection, then used every confused answer to make her look incapable. He believed he had taken everything. What he did not know was that Ruth still carried one envelope inside her winter coat. It contained the purchase agreement for Mercer County's abandoned seed laboratory, a crumbling building with broken greenhouse glass, dead refrigeration units, and rows of sample drawers everyone believed held nothing but dust. Days later, Ruth opened a sealed metal tray stamped RH-43. Inside were 12 packets of wheat seeds she had been told were destroyed 43 years earlier. Seeds from the research that had ended her career disappeared from county records and somehow resurfaced inside the billion-dollar variety Evan's corporate partner was preparing to sell. Her son had taken the farm because he thought his parents had nothing left to protect. He was about to learn that the most valuable thing they had ever grown had been waiting in the dark for Ruth to come back. If you've ever watched someone's years of knowledge dismissed simply because their hands moved slower or their memory stumbled once, stay with Ruth and Walter. Stories like theirs remind us that age does not erase dignity, skill, or the right to choose. And if that truth matters to you, subscribe and keep listening, because what waited inside that laboratory had not finished growing. Long before anyone questioned Ruth Hale's memory, people in Mercer County trusted her to understand what the land could not say aloud. She could rub a wheat kernel between her fingers and tell whether it had dried too quickly. She could study the underside of a leaf and name a disease before the first brown streak appeared. At 26, she worked in the county agricultural laboratory, weighing seed, recording rainfall, and crossing stubborn strains of wheat beneath fluorescent lights. Walter Hale belonged to the world outside those walls. He knew soil by smell, rain by the ache in his left knee, and machinery by the sound it made before a bearing failed. When they married, he owned 43 acres of exhausted ground and a tractor that stalled every winter. Ruth brought no inherited land or savings worth mentioning. She brought notebooks. Together, they rebuilt the farm one field at a time. Walter planted clover where his father had planted corn too many years in a row. Ruth tracked which sections held moisture longest. They stopped plowing the steepest slope and seeded it with grass to keep spring rains from carrying the topsoil into the creek. 5 years later, the Hale fields were still producing during a drought that ruined half the county's harvest. Ruth moved between the laboratory and the farm as if both were parts of the same unfinished experiment. Before sunrise, she checked the rain gauge. After work, she walked the fields with a clipboard beneath her arm. At night, she entered numbers into a ledger while Walter repaired tools at the kitchen table. Her most important project began during an outbreak of wheat rust. Ruth was assigned to assist Dr. Calvin Rusk in testing local strains for resistance. Most samples failed within weeks. One line, developed from a hardy mountain variety and a deep-rooted plains wheat, endured longer. Ruth refined it through repeated crosses, recording each change in a private shorthand. The 43rd line survived disease, poor soil, and long periods without rain. She labeled it RH-43. Then Evan became sick. He was 8 when a severe infection kept him in and out of the hospital for nearly 4 months. Walter managed the farm alone while Ruth divided her days between the laboratory, the pediatric ward, and home. One morning, Evan woke as she prepared to leave and asked whether her seeds needed her more than he did. Ruth resigned that week. Dr. Rusk promised her name would remain attached to the project and that the county would preserve her records. She believed him because she needed to believe that leaving did not mean losing everything she had built. She never returned. Evan recovered, but the farm entered 2 difficult years of debt and failed harvests. Ruth worked beside Walter full-time. She sold her microscope to cover a fertilizer bill and used retirement savings to replace a collapsed irrigation line. When Evan wanted to attend college in another state, they mortgaged the north field rather than ask him to stay. Neither parent reminded him what his future had cost. For decades, Walter handled equipment and planting schedules, while Ruth managed the books, seed selection, and soil records. Their decisions were cautious, sometimes old-fashioned, but rarely careless. Evan returned after college with a degree in agricultural business and little patience for anything that could not be measured on a quarterly report. He loved his parents, but he began speaking about the farm as if it were a company they had failed to modernize. He replaced paper ledgers with software Ruth had not requested, criticized Walter for repairing machinery, and called their seed-saving practices inefficient. At first, Ruth treated the disagreements as the ordinary distance between generations. Then North Star Agrigen arrived. Its representatives praised Evan's vision and offered to convert part of the farm into a commercial trial site. Ruth listened, while one representative described a new wheat variety that could tolerate drought, resist rust, and root deeply in damaged soil. Those were the 3 traits she had recorded beside RH-43. That evening, Ruth opened the wooden box where she kept old laboratory labels. The slips marked RH-38, RH-41, and RH-46 remained. The label for RH-43 was gone. A week later, a county notice announced that the abandoned seed laboratory would be sold as surplus property. Ruth folded the notice and placed it inside her coat pocket. For the first time in years, she did not tell Evan what she intended to do. The first sign that Evan had stopped asking for advice came disguised as convenience. He told Ruth he had scheduled a routine appointment because she had been tired and forgetful after a urinary infection. She had misplaced the farm checkbook once and written the wrong date on a feed invoice. To Evan, those mistakes were proof of decline. To Ruth, they were what happened when a 79-year-old woman slept 4 hours a night while fighting a fever. The appointment took place in a private clinic 30 miles from Mercer County. Evan drove. Walter wanted to come, but Evan said the doctor preferred to evaluate Ruth alone. The test lasted less than 20 minutes. A young clinician asked Ruth to remember 5 words: draw a clock showing 10 past 11, identify the day, and repeat numbers backward. Ruth missed 2 words, misplaced 1 clock hand, and gave the previous Tuesday's date. Then the clinician asked whether she could still manage the farm's finances. Ruth explained the operating loan, the fertilizer contract, and the difference between the farm account and land trust. She described the exact payment schedule on the Northfield mortgage and warned that a grain buyer's offer failed to account for storage costs. None of that appeared on the summary Evan later showed Walter. The paper said Ruth demonstrated possible cognitive impairment and recommended temporary assistance with complex financial decisions. It did not say she lacked capacity, but Evan spoke as though the conclusion had already been made. "We're not taking anything from you," he told them at the kitchen table. "We're putting safeguards in place." Walter set down his coffee. Safeguards usually protect the person who asked for them. Evan opened a second folder. He had already spoken to the bank, contacted a lawyer, and submitted a petition for temporary financial authority, claiming his parents might sign unfavorable contracts or lose the farm through mismanagement. Ruth read the petition twice. Several examples were technically true. A property tax payment had posted late because Evan changed the online password without telling her. A supplier invoice went unpaid because it had been redirected to Evan's email. A tractor bill appeared twice in the new bookkeeping system he installed. The pattern became obvious only when the documents were placed together. "You created the confusion," Ruth said. "I modernized the system," Evan replied. "You refused to learn it." Walter pointed toward the gray ledger on the sideboard. "That book has balanced for 37 years, and that is exactly the problem," Evan said. "A handwritten ledger is not a business plan." He sounded reasonable. That made the betrayal worse. Within a week, the bank required Evan's approval for withdrawals above $500. Ruth's debit card stopped working at the pharmacy. The farm fuel account moved to a new company profile. Employees who had taken instructions from Walter for decades were told to report to Evan. The changes arrived one at a time, each too small to justify a public fight. Together, they formed a fence. Evan began meeting North Star representatives in the farm office with the blinds closed. Ruth heard phrases such as yield licensing, proprietary germplasm, and acquisition bonus. When she entered carrying the mail, the conversation stopped. One afternoon, she found a memorandum on the printer. North Star planned to lease the southern acreage for commercial trials and convert the equipment barn into controlled seed storage. The agreement included a large payment if the Hale operation could provide legacy breeding material associated with county rust resistance research. Ruth read that sentence 3 times. The missing RH-43 label no longer felt like an old mystery. She returned the memorandum to the printer and said nothing. That evening, she moved her remaining laboratory notes into a canvas document case and checked the county surplus notice hidden inside her winter coat. The purchase had been approved 2 days earlier. The abandoned laboratory belonged to her, though the deed had not yet appeared in the county's online index. Ruth had bought it with money from a small savings certificate opened before Evan was born. Walter knew about the account. Evan did not. For the first time since the clinic appointment, one decision remained entirely hers. Evan accelerated his plans. He arranged for an assessor to visit without notifying them. Walter's machinery was photographed and catalogued. A brochure for an assisted living community appeared on the counter, open to a page advertising medication management and freedom from the burden of home maintenance. Walter carried it outside and used it to catch oil beneath a leaking mower. The confrontation came 2 mornings later. Evan arrived with a lawyer, 2 North Star employees, and a court order granting him temporary authority over farm finances until a full capacity hearing. The order was narrow, but he treated it as permission to control everything. He told the farmhands all decisions would now go through him. He canceled a seed cleaning appointment Ruth had scheduled. He ordered Walter not to operate the larger tractors until a safety review. Then he asked for the office keys. Walter did not move. "This farm was here before you learned to write your name," he said. "And I am trying to make sure it is still here after you are gone," Evan answered. For 1 second, Ruth saw the frightened child he had once been. Evan truly feared his parents would die and the farm would fail. But fear did not excuse what he had done. Ruth placed the key on the table. "You are confusing protection with ownership," she said. Evan looked relieved, as if her surrender proved him right. By afternoon, the locks had been changed. Ruth's files were boxed into the hallway. Walter's name vanished from the equipment schedule. Evan told them they could remain in the guest room for several days while he arranged a safer place. Ruth refused. She packed clothing, medicine, the canvas case, and the county papers. Walter took work gloves, 2 blankets, a toolbox, and the thermos they had carried through 40 harvests. A longtime farmhand, Samuel Price, stood near the machine shed as they loaded the truck. "I could open the back office for you," he whispered. Walter shook his head. "Then he would fire you before supper." Ruth did not ask anyone to choose sides. Loyalty offered under pressure often became another debt. Evan came outside before they left. "This is temporary," he said. "Once the evaluation is complete, we can discuss what makes sense." "You already decided what makes sense," Ruth replied. "You just forgot we were supposed to be part of it." Walter started the truck. As they passed the south field, Ruth saw bright survey flags marking the land North Star intended to use. Beyond them, the wheat moved as it had the morning Evan first walked to school, the year Ruth sold her microscope, and the season Walter worked with a broken wrist to save the harvest. The farm was still there. For the moment, it simply no longer belonged to the people who had built it. Ruth kept one hand over the envelope inside her coat. 20 miles away, behind rusted fencing and broken greenhouse panes, another place was waiting one. Evan considered worthless because he did not yet know what had been preserved there. The road to the old Mercer County Seed Laboratory had nearly disappeared beneath weeds. Walter drove slowly while Ruth held the county map against the dashboard. The property sat beyond the last working farm, where fields gave way to scrub grass and wind-bent cottonwoods. No sign marked the entrance anymore. Only 2 stone posts remained, one leaning toward the ditch. The chain across the gate had been cut years earlier. Walter stopped the truck and studied it. "That wasn't done by weather," he said. Ruth stepped down carefully. The infection had left her weaker than she wanted to admit, but the cold air sharpened her thoughts. She pushed aside a curtain of vines and found the old county emblem beneath layers of rust. For 28 years, the laboratory had been listed as surplus property. The county had closed it after federal funding disappeared, then postponed demolition when inspectors discovered old chemical tanks beneath the west wing. No company wanted the cleanup costs. No family wanted a building with cracked concrete, broken greenhouse panes, and an auction warning that said occupancy was not recommended. Walter removed the chain and drove through. The main building was a low structure of pale brick with narrow windows and a flat roof sagging near the center. Behind it stood the greenhouse, its metal ribs exposed through missing glass. "Well," Walter said, "no one can accuse us of moving somewhere too fancy." Ruth smiled for the first time that day. The front key turned only halfway. Walter worked graphite into the lock until the mechanism released. Inside smelled of dust, old paper, and mineral residue. Ruth stood just past the threshold, allowing the building to return in pieces. The receiving desk had been moved. The clock was gone. But the corridor still narrowed beside the records room, and the floor tiles still changed from gray to green near the germination wing. Walter watched her face. "You know where you are?" "I know where they moved things," she said. It was not the same answer, and both understood why that mattered. The administrative office had water damage along one wall, but the ceiling remained intact. A cast-iron stove stood in the corner beneath a blocked chimney. There was enough floor space for 2 cots. The taps produced only rust-colored air. Walter followed the pipes through a maintenance closet and found a diagram of a private well behind the boiler room. "That gives us a chance," he said. "Not comfort, a chance." Ruth moved into the seed inspection room. 3 magnifying lamps remained bolted to a counter. Wooden sample drawers covered one wall. Some hung open. Others were swollen shut. Drawer 14 was empty. Drawer 15 held a brittle envelope marked Barley 1972. The room beyond had once housed germination chambers. Their insulated doors stood open, revealing racks of wire shelving. The electrical panels were gone, but the old mechanical thermostats remained. Walter crouched near a floor vent and placed a scrap of tissue over it. The paper trembled toward the grate. "Air's moving. There's no power. Then something below is drawing it." Ruth remembered a secondary ventilation route connected to cold storage. She also remembered Dr. Rusk insisting certain samples be kept away from the main archive. The memory came with the sound of his ring tapping a clipboard. She wrote nothing down yet. Behind the germination wing, the greenhouse roof had collapsed across the central aisle. "We don't start there," Walter said. They returned to the office and made a practical list. Heat, water, a secure door, safe wiring, and a place to sleep. Whatever secrets the building held would remain where they were until Ruth and Walter could survive the night without freezing. Walter cleared the chimney, while Ruth swept broken glass and mouse nests from the office. They worked slowly, stopping often. Neither mentioned that tasks once completed before breakfast now consumed the afternoon. Near sunset, an aging county utility truck entered the yard. The driver introduced himself as Miles Danner, the property compliance officer. He carried a clipboard and wore the apologetic expression of a man assigned to deliver bad news. "I heard the transfer closed," he said. "I did not expect anyone this quickly." Ruth showed him the deed. Miles noticed the blankets and cots. "The sale does not include residential approval." "We know," Walter said. "If you stay overnight, I have to document it. The building has no occupancy certificate, and the West Wing may still contain contaminated storage." "We are not entering the West Wing," Ruth replied. Miles looked down the corridor. "Most buyers take one look and ask the county to reverse the sale. Can the county reverse it? Not unless taxes are unpaid or the safety order is ignored." He lowered his voice. "Someone called this morning asking whether the ownership record had posted." "Who?" "They said they represented an agricultural company." Miles handed them an inspection schedule. They had 30 days to establish safe water, working smoke alarms, a secure electrical zone, and restricted access to hazardous areas. It was not an eviction order. It was a narrow path forward. After he left, Walter repaired the stovepipe with sheet metal. Ruth sealed the office windows with old laboratory tape. By dark, a small fire warmed the room. They ate crackers, cheese, and apples from the truck. "This is not how I pictured our 58th year," Walter said. Neither was a retirement community with carpeted hallways. He covered her hand with his. Later, while Walter arranged the cots, Ruth returned to the records room. She found an old cabinet index inside a warped binder. RH-37 appeared near the bottom of one page. The next surviving entry was RH-47. The sheet between them had not fallen out. Its binding edge remained in place. Someone had cut the page away with a blade. A faint scrape sounded from the hall. Walter appeared holding a wrench. They searched together. No one stood in the corridor. But at the end of the seed room, A steel storage door carried a bright brass padlock that did not belong to the building. Walter touched it. This lock may be 5 years old, 10 at most. Dust beneath it had been disturbed in the shape of a boot heel. A second print crossed the room and vanished near the ventilation grate. Someone had entered the laboratory before them. Someone had removed the RH records. And whatever they had been looking for, they believed it was still inside. The first night in the laboratory was colder than either of them expected. By 10 o'clock, the fire in the cast-iron stove had lost its strength. Smoke leaked from a seam in the pipe, and the office windows clicked in their frames whenever the wind crossed the yard. Walter stuffed folded burlap into the widest gaps, while Ruth wrapped both blankets around her shoulders and tried not to cough. The building had survived abandonment. That did not mean it had survived well. Water still did not run. The private well pump had seized, the nearest restroom had a cracked drain, and the only usable electrical outlet produced a faint burning smell when Walter tested it. He unplugged the lamp immediately. "We work in daylight until I know what's inside those walls," he said. Ruth wanted to argue that the germination rooms required controlled light and temperature. Instead, she looked at his hands. The joints were swollen from cold, and a fresh split had opened across one knuckle. "We make the office safe first," she agreed. They slept in their coats. Before dawn, a sound traveled through the building, 3 light metallic knocks, a pause, then one more. Walter sat up with the wrench beside his cot. The sound came again from somewhere beyond the seed inspection room. They waited, listening for footsteps or a door. Nothing followed. At sunrise, Walter traced the noise to a loose damper inside the old ventilation system. Wind pressure lifted it, then let it fall against the duct. "Not a ghost," he said. "Disappointing. Give the place time." The joke helped, but only a little. The newer padlock and disturbed dust still had no harmless explanation. They began with the well. Walter removed the pump housing, cleaned rust from the shaft, and replaced a leather seal with material cut from an old tool pouch. Ruth worked beside him, recording each repair on the back of the inspection schedule. At noon, the pump shuddered and released a stream of brown water. They let it run into buckets until it cleared. Ruth used county test strips left in the maintenance cabinet to check for dangerous contaminants. The results were imperfect but encouraging. The water would need laboratory confirmation before drinking, yet it could be used for cleaning and flushing the drains. Walter leaned against the wall, breathing hard. "You should stop," Ruth said. "So should you. I am not the one pretending an 82-year-old back is a hydraulic jack, and you are not the one pretending fever disappears because there is work to do." The words landed harder than either intended. Ruth set down the test strip. "You did not have to come here." Walter's expression changed. "You think I came because you needed a caretaker? I think you lost your home because I kept one piece of my past hidden from Evan. We lost our home because our son decided age gave him permission to manage our lives. If I had told him about the purchase, he would have tried to stop you sooner." Walter wiped his hands on a rag. "Do not turn his choice into your guilt." Ruth looked toward the corridor. For 43 years, she had treated the laboratory as a door she had chosen to close. Standing inside it again, she could no longer tell where sacrifice ended and regret began. "I do not want this place to take what the farm did," she said quietly. "Your strength, your sleep, another 20 years of fixing what everyone else abandoned." Walter picked up the bucket. "Then we do it differently this time. We repair what keeps us alive. We leave the rest until it proves worth saving." It was not a promise to restore the whole building. It was a boundary, and Ruth accepted it. They spent the afternoon securing one electrical zone. Walter isolated damaged circuits and connected a portable generator from the truck to 2 outlets in the office and one in the germination wing. Ruth cleaned the mechanical thermostats with alcohol and a soft brush, careful not to force any dial. One unit still responded. Its needle rose when Walter directed warm air through the intake and fell when Ruth placed ice beside the sensor. The chamber could not maintain an exact temperature, but it was not dead. In the seed inspection room, Ruth examined the counter beneath the magnifying lamps. The central lamp was missing, leaving 4 empty bolt holes. Underneath, the steel base bore fresh scratches. She knelt, ignoring the ache in her knees. One screw was darker than the others. Another had been replaced with a modern Phillips head fastener, though the original equipment used slotted screws. "Someone opened this," she said. Walter brought the toolbox. Together they removed the bolts and lifted the heavy baseplate. Inside, was a narrow cavity containing a folded square of waxed paper. Ruth opened it carefully. The writing had faded to brown, but the letters were hers. Cold cycle first. 12 hours. Do not discard the weak grain. R.H. Walter read it twice. You wrote this? Yes. When? I don't remember hiding it. He waited, giving her room to decide what that meant. Ruth pressed the waxed paper flat against the counter. The handwriting was younger, sharper, more impatient, but the abbreviations matched the private notation in her old notebooks. A memory surfaced, not as a complete scene, but as fragments. Dr. Rusk demanding the remaining seed, a storm warning over the radio. Nora Bell pushing a cart past the germination room, and Ruth unscrewing something with trembling hands. She closed her eyes only long enough to arrange the pieces. I thought he might destroy the line, she said, or claim it before the final tests were complete. Did you hide the seed? I may have hidden the instructions. I still don't know who moved the samples. The note did not prove where RH-43 rested. It did prove Ruth had expected someone to interfere. They photographed it, placed it in a clean sleeve, and recorded the time and location. Ruth resisted the urge to search every bench immediately. If the building contained evidence, careless excitement could damage it faster than age had. By evening, the office held a steady flame. Clean buckets stood beside the sink, and one electrical circuit powered a lamp without overheating. Their progress was modest, but the place no longer felt entirely hostile. Then, Walter found the back door open. He had secured it with wire that morning. The wire now lay on the floor, neatly untwisted rather than broken. Outside, darkness covered the yard. Tire marks crossed the soft ground near the greenhouse, stopping short of the rear wall. They were narrower than the county truck's tracks. Walter reached for his flashlight. Ruth caught his sleeve. We stay together. They searched only the rooms they had already cleared. No stranger appeared. Nothing obvious was missing. But in the germination wing, the bright brass padlock had been scratched near the keyway. Whoever came had tried to enter the locked storage area and left when they heard Ruth and Walter moving through the building. Walter reset the door and wedged a metal cabinet against it. Ruth placed the waxed note beneath her cot. For the first time since arriving, she understood that the laboratory was not merely holding something forgotten. It was holding something another person still wanted. By morning, Ruth had turned the floor plan into a question. The old ventilation diagram showed a cold storage chamber beneath the germination wing, but no stairwell led to it. Walter traced the ducts with a pencil while Ruth compared the drawing to the room above. One line ended beneath the locked steel door. Another disappeared under the inspection bench. The chamber was never meant for people, Walter said. Only trays and air. Ruth studied the symbols. Then they would have needed a service opening. The brass padlock resisted 2 keys from the county ring. Walter refused to cut it immediately. If someone had installed it recently, the lock itself could matter. He photographed the scratches, measured the hasp, and wrote the details into their new log. They entered through the ventilation route instead. Walter removed the grate beside the inspection bench and found a narrow maintenance shaft descending 4 feet to a concrete crawlspace. At 82, he could not safely climb through it. Ruth could not either, so they built a mirror tool from an old inspection lamp, a broom handle, and wire. The reflected beam revealed a low chamber lined with cork insulation. 3 metal cases rested on a shelf along the far wall. One bore a faded red stripe. Ruth's mouth went dry. Walter used a hooked rod to drag the cases toward the opening 1 inch at a time. The first contained cracked glass vials. The second held packets of rye ruined by moisture. The third was heavier and sealed around the lid with dark wax. Stamped into the metal were 4 characters. Rye 43. Walter did not celebrate. He placed the case on a clean sheet, and Ruth photographed every side before touching the seal. The restraint mattered. After decades of being told her work was gone, she wanted to tear the lid open with both hands. Instead, she warmed a thin blade and lifted the wax without breaking more than necessary. Inside were 12 paper packets, each nested in cotton and marked with Ruth's private crossbreeding symbols. The kernels looked shrunken and dull, the color of old straw. They may still be dead, Walter said gently. I know. Ruth counted the packets twice. She remembered preparing 12 groups, each from a different section of the final test field. She had expected Dr. Rusk to destroy them after declaring the project unstable. In the bottom of the case lay a folded laboratory sheet. The first half contained germination percentages written in Ruth's hand. The lower half carried a later note signed by Calvin Rusk, claiming all surviving material had been transferred to a private research partner. The date beside his signature was 11 months after Ruth resigned. The ink was darker. The pressure of the pen had torn the paper slightly. Walter photographed the page. "We don't accuse anyone yet," Ruth said. "We prove what is here." They chose 36 kernels from the least damaged packets, 3 from each group. The remaining seed stayed in the case, resealed and placed inside a locked cabinet in the office. Ruth wrote the number removed, the packet codes, the time, and the condition of every sample. She prepared 4 trays. The first held sterilized sand. The second contained soil from outside the laboratory. The third used a blend Walter made from compost, clay, and the darker earth beneath the greenhouse foundation. The fourth remained empty as a contamination control. Ruth soaked the kernels in a mild solution, then placed them in the one chamber whose thermostat still worked. She set the temperature low for 12 hours, exactly as the wax note instructed. Nothing about the process looked dramatic. There was no flash of discovery, only damp paper, measured water, and a needle that moved too slowly to trust. For the next 3 days, nothing happened. Ruth checked the trays at dawn and before sleep. The kernels swelled slightly, but no root tips emerged. Condensation formed unevenly on the chamber door. Walter adjusted the seal and built a second thermometer from salvaged equipment to verify the first. On the 4th day, mold appeared in one packet group. Ruth removed the affected kernels and discarded them according to procedure. Walter saw the loss in her face. "You still have the other samples." "That group came from the west plot," she said. "It survived the worst rust. Then we record what failed." She nodded, though the answer did not comfort her. By the 6th day, several kernels had softened without sprouting. Ruth began to question whether the cold cycle had been too short, whether the old note referred to 12 days rather than 12 hours, or whether time had finally taken what Dr. Rusk could not. Walter suggested they stop for the evening. Ruth remained at the counter, studying one kernel beneath the magnifying lens. Its outer coat had split near the embryo, but the opening was too narrow to see clearly. "I told Evan memory was not the same as judgment," she said. "What if I remembered the process and judged it wrong?" Walter pulled a stool beside her. "Then you change the process because the evidence changed. That is judgment." The next morning, Ruth altered only one condition. She moved 6 kernels from the soil tray to a cooler chamber and extended the dark period. The rest remained untouched as controls. 2 days later, a white root tip appeared. It was no longer than a thread clipping. Ruth marked the time before allowing herself to call Walter. He came from the greenhouse carrying a section of pipe. When he saw the tray, he set it down without speaking. A second kernel opened that afternoon. By the 9th day, 7 seedlings stood above the soil. 3 were weak and pale. 4 were short, green, and unusually upright. Ruth did not call them a success yet. Walter built shallow test boxes with different soil depths. He planted the strongest seedlings in compacted earth, sandy loam, and the depleted soil beside the west fence. Beside them, he planted a commercial North Star wheat sample purchased before Evan froze their accounts. The difference did not appear at once. For 2 weeks, both varieties grew at nearly the same rate. Then Walter reduced watering. The North Star leaves curled by the 3rd dry day. The RH-43 seedlings slowed but remained upright. When Ruth lifted one test box, the commercial roots clustered near the surface. RH-43 had sent finer roots nearly twice as deep. She felt something in her chest loosen. That trait had been the reason she continued the project when Dr. Rusk wanted faster results. Deep roots did not impress visitors during early trials. They mattered when the rain failed. Ruth turned over the original laboratory sheet again. At the lower edge, beneath Rusk's later note, a strip of paper had been glued across the signature block. She softened the adhesive with controlled humidity and lifted one corner. Underneath was the beginning of her name, Ruth H. Someone had covered it rather than removing it. The discovery did not prove ownership by itself, but it proved alteration. That evening, Walter carried the trays into the restored light of the germination room. 7 green shoots cast thin shadows across the wall. Ruth opened a fresh ledger and wrote the date at the top of the first page. Sample RH-43, viable. Below it, she added a second line. Original attribution requires investigation. She closed the book just as headlights passed beyond the greenhouse. This time, the vehicle did not enter. It slowed near the gate, remained there long enough for someone to photograph the illuminated windows, then continued toward the highway. Walter watched from behind the curtain. "They know the building is alive again," he said. Ruth looked at the seedlings. So are the seeds. Nora Bell arrived the next morning, carrying a dented metal lunchbox and an umbrella with 2 broken ribs. She stopped just inside the gate and stared at the greenhouse as if the light in its windows had reached backward through time. Walter met her near the office. "Can we help you? I suppose that depends on whether Ruth Hale is here." Ruth stepped from the germination wing, wiping soil from her hands. For several seconds, Nora said nothing. Then she gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "You still hold your pencil the same way." Ruth remembered her slowly. Nora had worked in records and sample control, a quiet woman 12 years younger who pushed carts between storage rooms and knew which scientist had borrowed every tray. In Ruth's memory, Nora always wore her hair in a braid and carried a ring of brass keys at her waist. Now her hair was silver and cut short. The keys were gone. "I heard someone bought the laboratory," Nora said. "Then I heard lights were on in the germination room. I hoped it was you." Ruth led her inside, but did not show her the RH-43 case immediately. Trust, once neglected, needed evidence too. Nora placed the lunchbox on the inspection counter. Inside were carefully folded papers, each wrapped in waxed cloth. "I took these home when the county closed the archive," she said. "They were supposed to be shredded with duplicate inventory lists. I kept them because they were not duplicates." Walter opened the new evidence ledger. Nora noticed. "Good. Calvin Rusk never believed clerks understood chain of custody." "What do you remember about RH-43? Ruth asked. Nora sat down. "I remember Dr. Rusk ordering the final wheat material moved after you resigned. He said the county was transferring it to a private partner, but the shipment forms did not match the number of trays in storage." She unfolded the first document. It listed 6 cases approved for transport. A handwritten correction changed the total to 9. "The driver signed for 6, Nora continued. 3 stayed here." "Why?" Walter asked. "I never learned. Dr. Rusk told me to move them into the subfloor chamber and remove the location from the public index. A week later, he replaced the cabinet pages." Ruth thought of the clean blade cut in the binder. "Did you remove my name from the report?" Nora's face tightened. "No. I watched him cover it." The answer carried no drama, only an old shame that had been waiting for permission to speak. Nora explained that she had objected. She had written a memo to the County Agricultural Board stating that Ruth's initials appeared on the original sheets and that several women technicians had been omitted from the final report. The memo disappeared. Within a month, Nora was reassigned to vehicle records. Her pension classification was reduced because the county claimed her laboratory duties had been temporary. "I told myself I kept my job," she said. For years, that sounded like a reason. Ruth did not absolve her quickly. "You knew." "Yes." "And you stayed silent." "Yes." The word remained between them. Nora folded her hands. "I am not asking you to call that courage. I am asking whether the truth is still useful." Ruth looked toward the illuminated chamber where 7 seedlings stood beneath glass. "It may be." Only then did she show Nora the case. Nora did not touch it. She identified the wax pattern, the storage mark, and the narrow red stripe used for material under disputed ownership. She also recognized the initials of the technician who sealed the lid. "That man died in 1998, she said. "If the seal is original, anyone claiming these were planted here recently will have a difficult time." They spent the day documenting everything again with Nora present. Each packet was photographed beside a ruler. The seal fragments were placed in separate envelopes. Nora signed a statement describing the storage procedure from memory, then compared it against the forms she had preserved. Ruth felt the temptation to move faster. Every hour increased the chance that Evan or North Star would arrive. But speed had helped erase her once before. This time, the record would be patient. Walter cleared the former sample office for Nora to use. He repaired a desk drawer and found an old rubber stamp beneath it. Nora cleaned the stamp, pressed it into fresh ink, and tested it on scrap paper. "Mercer County Seed Control." The words appeared unevenly, but legibly. "I thought I would never see that again," she said. By late afternoon, the laboratory held 3 ledgers, one for seed access, one for environmental conditions, and one for visitors. Ruth wrote every name in full. The next visitor was Ben Carter. He arrived in a mud-spattered pickup with a paper bag of soil and the guarded expression of a man who had already heard too much gossip. Ben farmed 90 acres west of town. 2 dry summers and a fungus outbreak had left him behind on his loan. "I heard you have drought wheat," he said. "We have a small research sample," Ruth replied. "Not seed for distribution." His disappointment came quickly. "Then I wasted the drive." Walter took the paper bag from him. "Maybe, or maybe the seed is not your first problem." They spread Ben's soil across 3 trays. It had been heavily compacted and carried almost no organic matter. Ruth found signs of nutrient imbalance. Walter asked about his tillage schedule and learned Ben had deep plowed twice each season to control weeds. "You are opening the ground so often it cannot hold what rain it gets," Walter said. Ben bristled. "My father plowed that way. So did mine. He lost half the hill before I stopped copying him." Instead of offering RH-43, Ruth and Walter helped Ben design a smaller experiment using cover crops, reduced tillage, and a strip of untreated soil for comparison. Nora created a record sheet so the results would not depend on memory or opinion. Ben stayed to replace cracked panes in the office window. The following week, 2 more farmers came with soil samples. One brought no money. Ruth tested the soil anyway. Walter began marking demonstration beds outside the greenhouse. Nora established a shelf for local seed varieties that families had saved but never formally cataloged. The laboratory was still cold in the mornings. Half its rooms remained unsafe, yet cups appeared beside the sink, work gloves hung near the rear door, and people began knocking before entering. Ruth noticed the change one evening while writing labels. For decades, the building had stored seeds without serving anyone. Now, the first thing it preserved was not RH-43 but attention, the careful act of recording whose work belonged to whom. Nora opened another paper from her lunchbox. It was a funding ledger from the year after Ruth resigned. A company called Prairie Biological Holdings had paid consulting fees to Calvin Rusk. North Star Agrogen did not exist under that name at the time. But Ruth recognized Prairie Biological Holdings from a corporate history brochure Evan had left at the farmhouse. It had later merged into North Star. The line between her old work and Evan's new partner was no longer a suspicion. It was becoming a trail. Walter read the amount. "Enough money to buy silence?" "Enough to make silence comfortable," Nora said. Before they could study the remaining entries, Ben called from outside. A dark sport utility vehicle had stopped near the gate. No one got out. The driver lowered a window, raised a phone, and photographed the greenhouse, the test beds, and the 3 people standing in the doorway. Then the vehicle turned around and left. Nora watched it disappear. "They are not wondering whether RH-43 survived anymore," she said. Ruth closed the funding ledger and placed it in the locked cabinet. "No," she answered. "Now they are deciding how to take it." The first outdoor trial began on a strip of land Ben Carter had stopped planting 3 years earlier. The soil was pale, compacted, and thin enough that rainwater usually ran across it instead of sinking in. Walter chose it for that reason. If RH-43 survived only under careful laboratory conditions, North Star could dismiss the seedlings as a curiosity. If the plants endured here, the argument would become harder to contain. They divided the field into narrow plots. One held the surviving RH-43 plants. Another held the commercial North Star wheat Walter had purchased before Evan froze their accounts. A third was left unplanted to measure weeds, runoff, and soil change. Ruth insisted every row be labeled with code numbers rather than names. She did not want visitors deciding what they expected to see before the plants revealed it. Ben installed a simple fence. Nora recorded planting depth, spacing, and weather. Walter buried moisture gauges at 2 levels. Ruth kept one sealed set of leaves and roots from each variety, so later comparisons could not be accused of substitution. The work was slow, but nothing was casual. 2 weeks after planting, Dr. Lena Ortiz arrived from the State University in a faded blue sedan with a cooler in the back seat. She introduced herself without ceremony. Nora sent photographs of seedlings exposed to rust spores. "I assumed the labels were wrong." "They were not," Ruth said. "That is why I came." Lena was 46, a plant pathologist who studied disease resistance in cereal crops. She walked the plots once before asking questions. She did not praise the RH-43 plants or dismiss the commercial rows. She measured leaf angle, counted lesions, and took soil samples from both sides of the field. When she reached the laboratory, Ruth showed her the evidence log before the seedlings. Lena read every page. "You understand that surviving seed does not automatically establish legal ownership," she said. "I understand. And genetic similarity does not mean North Star copied the final product exactly." "I understand that too." Lena looked up. "What are you trying to prove? That the original line existed before they claimed to create it? That my name was removed? And that no one gets to take what remains until the record is honest?" It was the first answer that seemed to satisfy her. Lena collected tissue from RH43, the North Star comparison plants, and 2 unrelated county varieties. She sealed each sample in Ruth's presence, assigned blind identification numbers, and sent duplicates to separate laboratories. For the first time, the truth would leave Mercer County in more than one envelope. The field changed slowly. The North Star wheat grew faster at first, producing broad leaves that made the RH43 rows look sparse. Several visitors assumed the commercial variety was stronger. Ruth did not correct them. Early height had never been the point. Then the weather turned dry. For 11 days, the county received no measurable rain. Walter watered both plots equally, then reduced the amount according to the plan they had recorded before planting. The commercial leaves began folding inward by noon. RH43 remained shorter, but its color held. Walter dug a narrow trench beside one plant from each row. The North Star roots spread densely through the upper soil. RH43 sent fewer roots near the surface, and several long strands downward past the lower moisture gauge. Ben crouched at the edge of the trench. "That plant is reaching where the water still is." Walter nodded. "It was bred to survive after the easy water is gone." The next pressure arrived without invitation. A rust outbreak appeared first in a field 4 miles south of the laboratory. Orange spores traveled on the wind and settled across Ben's property. Within days, flecks appeared on both test plots. Lena returned before sunrise to document the exposure. The commercial plants developed spreading lesions along the lower leaves. RH43 showed smaller marks that stopped before reaching the central veins. Some plants still weakened, but the infection did not move through the row at the same rate. Lena removed her gloves and sat on an overturned bucket. "This is not immunity," she said. "Do not let anyone call it that." "I won't," Ruth answered. "But the response is unusual." Nora heard the caution in Lena's voice and smiled. "That is the closest scientists come to shouting." Lena almost smiled back. 3 weeks later, the first laboratory results arrived. The blind analysis showed that RH43 and North Star Dominion shared a cluster of uncommon genetic markers associated with rust response and root depth. They were not identical. Dominion had been crossed and modified over multiple generations, but the probability of unrelated development was extremely low. One result mattered even more. RH43 carried a stable version of a root development trait that appeared fragmented in Dominion. North Star had the descendant. Ruth had the source. Lena explained the distinction at the long inspection table while Walter listened with his arms folded. "This does not prove every legal claim," she said. "It does prove North Star's public history is incomplete. Their variety did not begin where they say it began." Ruth ran her finger beneath the marker sequence without touching the paper. "Can they reproduce the stable line from Dominion?" "Possibly, after years of work. Or they can obtain your original material." That answered why North Star had asked Evan to find legacy breeding stock. It also explained why the company had waited until now to pressure the family. Land was valuable. RH43 was strategic. The laboratory could no longer remain quiet. Ben mentioned the trial at a grain cooperative meeting. Someone posted photographs of the 2 rows online. The caption called Ruth and Walter, an elderly couple playing scientist in a condemned building. The mockery lasted less than a day. Then a farmer whose Dominion field had been damaged by rust shared the image again and asked why the shorter row was still standing. Local reporters began calling. Ruth declined interviews until Lena completed the second laboratory comparison. Walter found 3 strangers at the fence one morning. Instead of sending them away, he explained the plot codes without naming the varieties. 2 listened. 1 laughed and left. By the end of the week, the laughing man returned with a notebook. Ruth watched from the greenhouse and understood that recognition did not arrive as applause. It arrived as questions people could no longer ignore. The phone in the office rang late that afternoon. Nora checked the caller identification and handed the receiver to Ruth. Evan's name appeared on the small screen. Ruth let it ring once more before answering. "Mother," he said, using the careful tone he had used at the kitchen table. "I saw the photographs. You did not call when you heard we were living here. I did not know how serious the situation was. You knew enough to send someone to watch the gate." He did not deny it. After a pause, Evan asked, "Is the tray marked RH-43? Ruth looked through the office window toward the field. The two wheat plots moved under the same wind, but only one had kept its strength through drought and disease. "Why does North Star need to know?" she asked. Evan's breath caught. That small hesitation told her more than an answer would have. Outside, Lena sealed the final field samples. Nora entered the day's measurements. Walter repaired a loose section of fence that now protected evidence rather than property. Ruth held the phone against her ear. For the first time since Evan took control of the farm, he was the one asking for information she had no obligation to give. Evan arrived at the laboratory 2 mornings later in a black sedan that did not belong on the rutted county road. A second vehicle followed carrying Grant Mercer, North Star Agrogen's regional counsel, and a woman from the county building department. Evan stepped out first, wearing the expression of a son prepared to be disappointed by his parents. Walter met them at the gate. "You called an inspector before you called to ask whether we had heat," he said. Evan glanced toward the repaired greenhouse. "I am trying to prevent this from becoming more dangerous." "You mean more valuable?" Grant Mercer closed his car door softly. He had silver glasses and a voice designed to make threats sound like procedure. "No one is here to threaten you," he said. "We are here to clarify ownership and safety obligations." Ruth came from the office carrying the visitor ledger. "Then sign in." Grant hesitated before writing his name. Evan did not. Ruth placed the ledger in front of him again. "You do not enter until you sign." For most of his life, Evan had walked through every door his parents owned without knocking. Now he stood outside a property he had dismissed as worthless, waiting for his mother's permission. He signed. Inside, Grant requested access to all surviving seed material, environmental records, and historical files connected to county research. He explained that samples preserved in a public facility might remain subject to county contracts or sponsor rights, regardless of who later purchased the building. "Which contract are you relying on?" Ruth asked. "That is part of what we are determining." "So you came to collect property before determining whether it belongs to your client." "We came to preserve potentially disputed material. The material is preserved." She showed him the sealed cabinets, visitor log, temperature records, duplicate samples held by Lena, and envelopes containing fragments of the original wax seal. Grant's expression did not change, but he stopped describing Ruth as confused. Evan moved toward the germination wing. Walter stepped between him and the door. "You cannot keep me from seeing what is affecting the family farm," Evan said. "This is not the farm. I have financial authority for both of you." "Temporary authority over specified accounts," Ruth corrected. "Not ownership of property I purchased before your order took effect." Grant asked to see the deed. Ruth handed him a certified copy. The purchase had been completed with funds from an account Evan did not control, and the deed named Ruth alone. For the first time that morning, Evan looked uncertain. "The question of the samples remains separate," Grant said. "So does the question of why North Star knew to ask for RH material before anyone outside this building knew it had survived," Ruth replied. The county inspector introduced herself as Denise Ward. Unlike Grant, she seemed uncomfortable being used as part of a performance. "I need to inspect the occupied areas," she said. Walter showed her the isolated electrical circuit, smoke detectors, labeled hazardous zones, water results, and temporary living quarters. Most improvements met the emergency checklist. Several did not. The west corridor lacked a fire-rated barrier. The greenhouse exit was obstructed by collapsed framing. The office ceiling showed moisture damage. "You have made progress," Denise said. "But I cannot approve continued residential use unless these items are corrected within 30 days. Evan seized on the deadline. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. Come home. We will sort out the legal issues from the farm." Ruth studied him. "Will the office locks be changed back?" Evan looked toward Grant. "Will my accounts be released? This is not the time. Will North Star's trial agreement be suspended while the source of dominion is investigated?" His face hardened. "You are tying unrelated issues together. They became related when your company asked you to search my records." Grant intervened. Mrs. Hale, North Star is prepared to arrange safe housing and cover the cost of restoring this property. In return, the company would take temporary custody of RH-43 while ownership is reviewed. Walter gave a short laugh. You offer to repair the cage after taking the bird. Grant ignored him. Keeping the material here exposes you to theft, contamination, and liability. Then your client should stop sending people to photograph the gate, Ruth said. Evan stepped closer. You think this is about greed. It is about saving the farm. North Star can clear the debt, replace the equipment, and guarantee income for years. I found a way to keep everything you built. You found a way to keep the land after removing us from it. I was protecting you. No, you were protecting a plan that required us to agree. Evan lowered his voice. If you turn North Star against us, the farm could fail. Ruth felt the old instinct to rescue him, the instinct that had made her leave the laboratory when he was 8 and mortgage the North Field when he was 18. She did not obey it this time. A farm is not saved when the people who built it lose the right to decide what it becomes. Denise handed Walter the written notice. 30 days. The deficiencies were real, but the order did not require immediate closure. Grant then produced another document. North Star had filed for an emergency injunction preventing Ruth from selling, transferring, reproducing, or distributing RH-43 until ownership could be resolved. A hearing was scheduled in 12 days. Evan had also requested a full competency evaluation for both parents, arguing that their refusal to accept safe housing showed impaired judgment. Walter read the papers and handed them to Ruth. The attack was careful. If North Star could not claim the seed directly, it would question the capacity of the person holding it. Grant removed a pen. Sign a voluntary preservation agreement. Transfer the tray to North Star's secured facility, and we can ask the court to postpone the hearing. Ruth did not take it. Who would have access to the seed? Authorized personnel. Named personnel? That would be determined internally. Would any seed be propagated? Grant paused. Ruth closed the folder. No. Evan's composure cracked. You would risk the farm over a tray of old wheat? I am refusing to surrender evidence to the company being questioned. Nora entered carrying one of her preserved inventory sheets. She had spent the morning comparing its control numbers with Calvin Rusk's funding ledger. There may be another copy, she said. The lower corner bore a filing code from the State Agricultural Extension Archive. If the archive retained the matching report, it could establish when RH-43 was created, who submitted it, and whether the county ever legally transferred the original line. Grant asked to see the sheet. Nora held it against her chest. You can request it through counsel. Ruth called Lena and asked her to move one sealed duplicate sample into university custody and suspend further testing until the court established a protocol. The main tray would remain locked at the laboratory under documented access. Then Ruth telephoned the county clerk and requested every document related to the competency order, the North Star filing, and the extension archive code. She made each call in front of Evan. No raised voice, no confused questions, no uncertainty about what she wanted. When the visitors left, Evan remained near the gate. You could still come home, he said. Ruth placed her hand on the latch. Home is not a place where someone else decides when I am allowed to use my own key. She closed the gate between them. Behind her, the laboratory carried 30 days of repairs, 12 days before a hearing, and 7 living seedlings that had become evidence in a fight far larger than the ruined building around them. For the first time, Ruth was not waiting for someone else to recognize her competence. She was preparing to prove it. The hearing began in a room too small for the number of people who had come to watch. Farmers filled the back benches. 2 local reporters stood near the door. North Star's attorneys occupied one table with matching folders, while Ruth, Walter, Nora, and Lena sat at the other beside a single clear evidence case containing one sealed packet of RH-43. Judge Miriam Cole entered at 9 sharp and reminded everyone that the court was considering 3 connected questions: whether Evan's temporary financial authority should continue, whether Ruth and Walter were capable of directing their own affairs, and whether North Star was entitled to control the surviving seed while ownership was disputed. Grant Mercer began with concern. He described 2 elderly people living in a condemned laboratory, operating aging equipment, and refusing safer housing. He introduced late invoices, the clinic summary, photographs of the damaged greenhouse, and the inspection notice. Evan testified next. He spoke without anger, That made him sound credible. My parents built something important, he said. I was afraid they would lose it because they would not accept help. Grant asked about Ruth's missed pharmacy payment, Walter's old tractor accident, and the confusion created by handwritten ledgers. Evan answered carefully. He did not say he wanted their land. He said he wanted continuity. Then, Ruth's attorney asked who changed the online passwords. Evan hesitated. I updated the system. Who redirected supplier invoices to your email? I centralized communications. Who installed software your parents could not access without credentials you controlled? Evan looked toward the judge. I was trying to modernize operations. The attorney placed 3 dates on a screen. Each supposed example of Ruth's financial failure occurred after Evan had changed the system. The fence he built around their lives became visible one post at a time. The physician who conducted the original screening admitted that Ruth had been recovering from infection, taking medication, and sleeping poorly. He also confirmed the 20-minute assessment was never intended to establish legal incapacity. A second specialist presented the full evaluation Ruth completed after leaving the farm. Her processing speed was slower than average for a younger adult. Her judgment, reasoning, financial comprehension, and ability to understand consequences were intact. Judge Cole turned to Ruth. Mrs. Hale, do you understand the risks of remaining at the laboratory? Yes. Name them. Ruth listed the damaged west corridor, the incomplete fire barrier, the restricted chemical zone, the greenhouse exit, and the 30-day compliance deadline. She explained which repairs were complete, which remained, and what temporary measures Denise Ward had approved. Why not accept your son's offer to return home? Because it required me to surrender disputed evidence to the company whose claim we are examining. No one in the room could mistake that answer for confusion. The hearing then shifted to RH-43. Nora testified first. She described the old sample control system, the 3 cases withheld from the private shipment, and Calvin Rusk's order to remove their location from the public index. Grant challenged her memory. You are describing events from more than 4 decades ago. Yes. And you kept county documents in your home without authorization. Yes. So the court should trust a witness who violated procedure. Nora opened her preserved inventory list. The procedure required 6 cases to leave. The driver signed for 6. The altered copy says 9. I kept the page because someone was changing the record after the fact. She did not defend every choice she had made. She only showed what the documents could still prove. The State Agricultural Extension Archive supplied the next piece. Its custodian presented a microfilmed report received 43 years earlier. The document listed the RH-43 cross, the disease response observations, the deep root trait, and the name of the submitting researcher, Ruth Elaine Hale. 2 technicians had signed as witnesses. Both signatures predated Ruth's resignation. The archive's receipt stamp appeared 11 months before Prairie Biological Holdings paid consulting fees to Calvin Rusk. Grant argued that authorship did not establish ownership. Ruth agreed. The courtroom shifted when she did. I am not claiming that every farmer, researcher, or company that later worked with this material owes me their harvest, she said. I am saying Northstar cannot call the source its private invention, and it cannot take the surviving original while pretending the source never existed. Lena then explained the blind genetic analysis. She avoided dramatic language. RH-43 and Northstar Dominion were not identical. Dominion carried later modifications, but both shared an uncommon cluster of markers associated with rust response and root architecture. The stable version present in RH-43 appeared fragmented in Dominion. In scientific terms, Judge Cole asked, what does that suggest? That Dominion likely descends from material related to RH-43, Lena said, and that RH-43 may contain a more stable ancestral form of a trait Northstar has been trying to recover. Grant asked whether independent discovery was possible. Possible, Lena said. Probable, given the historical and genetic record. No, Walter's evidence was less technical but equally precise. He presented the environmental ledger, watering schedule, soil depths, and control plots. He explained every correction they had made and every failed kernel they had discarded. Grant tried to portray the work as improvised. Walter held up the ledger. Improvised means changing without recording. We changed because the evidence changed, and we wrote down why. Then came the contract. Northstar had resisted producing it. but the court ordered the relevant sections disclosed. The agreement promised Evan a substantial acquisition bonus if he delivered recoverable legacy germplasm associated with Mercer County rust resistance trials. Ruth watched her son read the language on the screen. Judge Cole asked him when North Star first requested RH material. "Before my parents left the farm," Evan said. "Did that request influence your decision to search your mother's files?" "Yes." "Did you disclose the potential bonus when seeking temporary financial authority?" "No." The single word damaged more than any accusation could have. Evan tried to explain. North Star's money would have cleared the farm debt. The trial agreement would have guaranteed income. He believed his parents would refuse because they distrusted corporations and because Ruth was emotionally attached to work she had abandoned decades earlier. Judge Cole interrupted. "Did you believe refusal itself proved incapacity?" Evan looked at his mother. "I believed they could not see what was practical. That was not my question." After a long pause, he answered, "No." Grant made one final request. Until ownership was resolved, North Star wanted the RH-43 tray transferred to a commercial vault. Ruth's attorney proposed a neutral alternative. The original tray would remain sealed under joint court and university supervision. No party could propagate or transfer material without written approval. Ruth accepted immediately. North Star did not. That refusal clarified the company's interest more effectively than another hour of testimony. Judge Cole issued her ruling before sunset. Evan's temporary authority was terminated. Ruth and Walter were legally capable of managing their affairs. The bank was ordered to restore access to their accounts, and any property agreement signed under Evan's authority would be reviewed. North Star's request for exclusive custody was denied. The court ordered the company to preserve all internal records relating to Prairie Biological Holdings, Calvin Rusk, Mercer County Research, and the development of Dominion. RH-43 would remain under neutral protection while attribution and contractual rights were investigated. Outside the courtroom, Grant approached Ruth with a new offer. North Star would pay enough to restore the farm, rebuild the laboratory, and leave a substantial inheritance for Evan's children. In exchange, the company wanted an exclusive license to RH-43 and a confidentiality agreement concerning the historical record. Ruth read the first page and returned it. "You are still offering money for silence. I am offering security. Security that can be revoked by whoever controls the contract is another kind of dependence." She walked past him. At the courthouse steps, reporters asked what she planned to do with the seed. Ruth looked at Walter, then Nora, Lena, Ben, and the farmers who had crowded the hearing room. "RH-43 will not become one more thing hidden behind a locked door," she said. "We will place it in a community seed trust. Researchers may study it. Farmers may use it under fair terms. No company will own the right to erase where it came from." Evan stood several yards away. For the first time, there was no folder in his hand, no attorney beside him, and no decision left for him to make on his parents' behalf. Ruth did not go to him. Winning back her freedom did not require pretending the wound had already healed. The first thing Ruth did after the ruling was not return to the farmhouse. She and Walter drove back to the laboratory, unlocked the office, and placed the court order beside the visitor ledger. The document restored access to their accounts, ended Evan's temporary authority, and required a review of every agreement he had signed in their names. Walter read the first page, then folded it closed. "Paper gave him power," he said. "Paper took it back." Ruth looked toward the greenhouse. "The paper matters. What we do next matters more." The audit took 6 weeks. Evan had transferred money between operating accounts and committed the farm to North Star's trial program, but he had not completed a sale. The court required him to return the funds, surrender control of the software system, and cooperate with the investigation into North Star's search for legacy seed. Ruth declined to pursue criminal charges as long as he complied. It was not forgiveness. It was a boundary shaped by what she could live with. Evan was removed from management. Walter restored access for the farmhands, then hired an independent bookkeeper rather than reclaiming every responsibility himself. Ruth converted the old, handwritten ledgers into a system she could access without anyone controlling the password. They did not pretend the old way had been perfect. They simply refused to let modernization become another word for exclusion. North Star withdrew from the farm agreement. Months later, the company revised the published history of Dominion and acknowledged that material originating in Mercer County research had contributed to its development. The larger investigation continued, uncovering other technicians whose work had been credited to supervisors or corporate partners. Nora read each corrected name aloud when the State Archive sent the amended record. Some belonged to people who had died without seeing it. The laboratory passed inspection 3 days before the deadline. Ben and 6 other farmers cleared the greenhouse exit. Denise Ward returned to examine the fire barrier and approved the living quarters. Donations paid for new wiring, but Walter insisted on keeping the cast-iron stove. "It kept us alive before anyone thought the building was worth saving," he said. By spring, the former receiving room had become a public seed library. Families brought jars of beans, corn, rye, and garden seed saved across generations. Nora accepted each donation only after recording who had grown it, where it came from, and what story traveled with it. No anonymous labor entered the archive again. Lena helped create a research agreement for RH-43. Universities could study it. Small farmers could receive seed at low cost. Commercial use required transparent attribution and contributions to the trust. No company could obtain exclusive control over the original line. They named the organization the Hale Community Seed Trust. Ruth objected at first. "This was never only ours," she said. So, beneath the name, the charter listed every known technician, farmer, clerk, and researcher connected to the work. Blank lines remained for names still waiting to be recovered. Walter leased portions of the farm to younger growers who agreed to rebuild soil rather than exhaust it. Ben planted the first community field of RH-43 on land that had failed him 2 seasons earlier. The wheat did not make anyone rich. It produced a steady harvest through a dry summer, resisted the worst of the rust, and left enough seed for the following year. To Ruth, that was more meaningful than a dramatic fortune. The line had been created to keep ordinary farms alive. At last, it was doing what it had been bred to do. Evan's first apology arrived by mail. It filled 4 pages and explained fear, debt, pressure, and the belief that he alone understood what was practical. Ruth read it once and placed it in a drawer. An explanation was not yet repair. 3 months later, he came to the laboratory without a lawyer or a folder. He stopped at the gate and waited until Walter saw him. "I came to work," he said. Walter handed him a post-hole digger. For several Saturdays, Evan repaired the outer fence. Ruth spoke to him about weather, tools, and meals, but not trust. He did not ask for keys. He did not enter the records room. When a reporter approached him, he refused to describe himself as part of the trust's leadership. One afternoon, he admitted that he had treated his parents' disagreement as proof they were incapable. "I thought being afraid of losing the farm gave me the right to take control," he said. Ruth set a tray of cleaned seed on the counter. "You were afraid of losing property," she replied. "You did not notice you were losing us." He accepted the words without defending himself. That was the first moment Ruth believed change might be possible. Not complete, not guaranteed, possible. By autumn, the test field beyond the greenhouse had turned gold. Farmers and students gathered for the first community harvest. Nora stood beside the archive shelves, showing a group of young researchers how to document a sample before opening it. Lena examined roots with 2 teenagers who had never entered a laboratory before. Walter carried a wooden tray to Ruth. She filled it with seed from the new harvest and wrote the label slowly. RH-43 Mercer Community Line. Below it, she added every contributor's name the trust had recovered. There was still space left. Ruth placed the tray on the shelf, where the original case had rested in darkness for 43 years. Then she locked the climate cabinet and kept the key in her own pocket. Outside, Evan repaired the final section of fence. Walter set an extra chair near the greenhouse door, not inside the records room, but no longer beyond the gate. Ruth joined her husband beneath the evening light. Across the field, wheat bent and rose beneath the wind, each stalk carrying more seed than the one from which it had grown. Behind them, the laboratory door remained open for anyone who came to learn, contribute, or begin again. For years, the world had treated Ruth and Walter like seeds past their season. But some things are not dead when they disappear from view. Sometimes, they are only waiting for the right ground, the right light, and the freedom to grow in their own name.